Hello my friends and welcome to the channel for a look at my Frost Explosion Mercenary build for Path of Exile 2. I've been really loving the 0.3 patch for PoE 2, and for this league I decided to start off with the Mercenary since it was a character I had never played before, and it also happened to get a lot of changes and buffs in this update, specifically with how the Fragmentation round skill interacts with frozen enemies to get a big single target and AoE damage hit. Normally I play until about level 65 and then start looking for build guides from other people to help me finish off maps. But in this league I've actually managed to make it to level 90 and I've been running tier 15 plus maps all with my own build, and I was pretty proud of that, so I wanted to share it. I'm not really a veteran PoE 2 build optimizer, so I also figured this might be a good opportunity to get some feedback on the build from anyone watching who simply knows more about the game than I do, because my god does this thing have so many layers to it. So feel free to drop your constructive criticism in the comments if you have any suggestions. For the structure of this video, I'll start off talking about the overall focus of this build, the main skills, and how they progressed from early leveling and into mid-game when you start to get better support gems, unique items, and higher level skills. After that, I'll go a bit more in-depth into the skills and support gems I settled on once I hit maps, and look at each skill and support gem individually. Then I'll go over my passive skill tree and the ascendancy skills I took, and finally we'll finish it off with a quick look at my equipment. Alright, to get this started, this build is essentially a cold damage based crossbow build, with the main action cycle being freezing enemies and then killing them either outright with raw damage or popping them with fragmentation rounds for the big burst damage. It's also using Herald of Ash at low levels and Herald of Ice at higher levels for additional AoE when you kill enemies, plus the Witch Hunter Ascendancy for even more potential AoE damage off of every single kill. By stacking as much freeze buildup as possible, it was really easy to get the freeze proc on enemies and bosses, and the Mercenary passive tree has some pretty solid nodes to increase freeze buildup and the payoff for freezing enemies. The main skills I used for clearing the early campaign up until around level 33 was Permafrost bolts, fragmentation rounds, Herald of Ash, and the explosive grenade skill simply for some extra damage against bosses and rare monsters. At around level 33 to 35, you can pick up the only key unique that I used in this build, the Blueflame Bracers, which converts all fire damage to cold damage, which then allows you to switch over to the explosive bolt skill for wave clearing while still benefiting from all the buffs to freeze buildup and extra damage from killing frozen enemies granted by Herald of Ice. For the early game, I just put the freeze and double barrel support gems into Permafrost bolts. Freeze massively increases your freeze buildup, obviously, and I just found double barrel very useful to deal with larger packs of enemies and set up more enemies to pop when they're frozen. You can also add things like cold attunement and cold penetration gems as well for extra damage if you have the extra slots. For fragmentation rounds, I basically just used frozen spite to increase damage when you consume freeze on enemies, and then cold attunement for extra cold damage and nimble reload later on, so I was less likely to miss timing on frozen enemies. I also did use explosive grenades throughout the early to mid campaign just for some extra damage. You have time to fire 2 grenades when bosses are frozen and still hit them with fragmentation rounds, so that was pretty useful sometimes, but it wasn't really a core skill for the build, it was just some bonus damage. For my first spirit skill, I used Herald of Ash to create explosions when killing enemies, and I found the extra cold damage was pretty helpful during the early game. You want to switch this to Herald of Ice as soon as you can, but this skill requires a bit of intelligence investment, and mercenary gear and skills require both strength and dex. So I had to wait until I could get some gear and skill nodes with plus intelligence before I could make the switch, but it's definitely worth it. The second spirit skill I added onto the build is Shard Scavenger, which is a crossbow specific aura that reloads your crossbow skills and gives them infinite ammo after consuming freeze on an enemy with fragmentation rounds. This is really helpful for speeding up wave clear, but it's kind of useless in some boss fights. I think in the endgame past level 80, you could argue for swapping this for a defensive aura instead, but the free reload from this skill can definitely save you sometimes when you're surrounded by breach enemies or delirium enemies. Once I hit Act 4 and the interludes, I picked up the Blueflame Bracers unique gloves, and then I started experimenting with explosive bolts now that the fire damage was converted to cold damage. I found this to be a pretty huge upgrade for my wave clear, and it's also a good source of sustained damage against bosses while you wait for their freeze resistance to wear off after freezing them with permafrost bolts. This unique is super cheap on the trading website, only 1 exalted orb. But for solo self-bound players, I guess you just have to hope to get lucky, or you could drop an orb of chance on some gold cast cuffs. After I made that switch, I basically started to focus my build around cold infused explosive bolts. So now let's take a look at how I set up my skills for the late campaigns and maps with this focus in mind. First up, the main skill is now kind of split between explosive bolts and permafrost bolts, with fragmentation rounds still just used to pop frozen enemies for huge damage, because this actually scaled quite well the higher level I got. For explosive bolts, the first support gem that I settled on was double barrel, because I felt like one shot between reloads was a little bit slow. This gem does reduce your reload speed slightly, but if you stack some reload speed from the passive tree, you can offset this pretty well. If you have the divine orbs to afford it, I would also highly recommend getting the unique version of this support gem called Ratha's Assault. This gem removes the ability to manually reload, but instead you reload every time you dodge roll, which is just infinitely better. This gem also adds 3 rounds to your clip instead of 1, which speeds up your wave clear immensely. Next up, we have a choice between multi-shot or Nova projectiles to modify how many rounds explosive bolts fires each time you shoot it. I started off with multi-shot and I played with it for most of the time I spent on this build. But then I swapped to Nova projectiles, and to be honest, I wish that I had used Nova projectiles the entire time instead. I was really hesitant to try it out because of the 40% damage reduction from the Nova projectiles gem, but the increase in AoE and wave clear potential from this support gem is kind of insane, especially when it stacks up the explosion triggers from Witch Hunter and Herald of Ice all across the screen instead of just in one direction. A kind of underrated benefit of Nova projectiles as well is that it actually lets you dodge roll out of the animation of shooting much faster, because the projectiles all emanate from you simultaneously. This speeds up your fire rate too in a way, so overall I really do think it is the better way to go after trying it out. This also combos really well with the Ratha's Assault gem to basically give you infinite ammo if you keep rolling between every shot to reset the timing. Multi-shot is kind of better against single targets like bosses, but honestly for bosses a lot of your damage is coming from fragmentation rounds anyways. And you could always just be cheeky and carry around a multi-shot gem in your inventory to swap out before boss rooms, and that's actually what I'm doing with this build. For the last 3 support slots on explosive bolts, I just stacked on Elemental Armament 2, Cold Penetration, and Cold Attunement for extra damage and resistance penetration against cold resistant enemies. Next up, let's look at Permafrost bolts, which I did neglect for a while after switching to explosive bolts, but eventually I realized it was still kind of one of the best options against bosses and rare monsters, because it procs the freeze really fast compared to explosive bolts, and then you can hit them with fragmentation rounds to get the huge bit of burst damage. While explosive bolts is much better at clearing trash mobs, Permafrost bolts accumulate so much more freeze buildup against enemies that it's really good against tankier enemies like rares and bosses. On this skill, I'm using double barrel for extra shots to build up freeze more quickly, the freeze gem to increase freeze buildup, ice bite which increases damage of other attack skills after freezing with this skill, and then cold penetration and elemental armament for extra damage, though honestly these last 2 are not necessary, they're just free bonus damage if you have all 5 slots on this skill. For my last main damaging skill, I'm still using fragmentation rounds, because even though the actual projectile doesn't do very much damage, when it consumes freeze on a frozen enemy, it's actually the highest burst damage on this build by a pretty huge margin. For support gems on this skill, I'm using Biting Frost, which increases the damage against frozen targets by 40%. Then I'm using Nimble Reload because you never want to miss the timing window on a frozen boss or rare monster, so the extra reload speed is pretty helpful for that. I'm also using Frozen Spite to create exploding ice fragments on kill, and then you could fill in the last slot with Cold Attunement or Elemental Armament or Cold Penetration for extra damage if you wanted to. Next up, for my spirit skills, I'm still using Herald of Ice and Shard Scavenger. For Herald of Ice, I'm using the Deadly Herald and Cold Attunement support gems for extra damage, and you can also put in Cold Penetration as well or Cold Mastery to increase this skill by 1 level. I'm kind of unsure what the best choice is for the 3rd or 4th support slot, so any recommendations would be pretty helpful. For Shard Scavenger, I'm using Prolonged Duration for a longer infinite ammo buff, and then Cannibalism to recover health on kill while the buff is active. Honestly, I'm not sure which skill Cannibalism is better on, Herald of Ice or Shard Scavenger, so let me know what you think down in the comments. Okay, next up, let's take a look at my passive tree for this build. Generally, I don't think I took any defensive nodes until like level 60 plus when I started doing maps and needed to start getting tanky, but I'm just going to cover it starting from the beginning and show every notable passive that I took on this build for endgame. First up, I started on the right hand side at the beginning, taking the projectile damage nodes and going for Remorseless and then Ricochet. Then I took a slight dip to the right hand side for the Immobilization buildup nodes and the Fearful Paralysis Notable, which gives enemies a debuff whenever you freeze them. I also dipped into the Feel No Pain, Battle Hardened, and Exposed Wounds notable passives here at the start of the skill tree for extra armor, evasion, and freeze buildup. Next, I took this entire tree of two-handed damage passive nodes to increase crossbow damage, and you also get 10 strength and 10 dex out of this too, which is pretty helpful because you actually need a lot of attributes on this build. Continuing on, I took the left path for Steady Footing for some extra stun resistance, and there's a bunch of armor and evasion passives off to the left here that I did end up taking later on into the endgame. From here, I took kind of a big dip over to the Huntress skill tree, starting with Adrenaline Rush for the extra movement speed. On the way over to the right, I took the Rapid Reload notable, which is really helpful in the mid game. I also dipped into all these armor and evasion nodes as well later into the end game. The real point of this dip over to the Huntress tree though is to get the Run and Gun and Spray and Pray notable passives from the Huntress tree. These passives give you awesome buffs to projectile skills while moving, and I found them to be really good on this build, and they combo really well with the Nova projectiles on the explosive bolts because you can just keep moving around and firing stuff in all directions and you get a lot of good buffs. Right next to these nodes, there's also a whole section of elemental attack buffs, so I took both the Forces of Nature and Emboldened Avatar notable passives, which increase your freeze buildup and your elemental resistance penetration. There's also some evasion buffs here too, which you can take if you have spare points later on. Back to the main Mercenary tree though, I shot straight down to the end and then to the right into the big crossbow section. Here I took everything related to crossbow damage and reload speed, and I think for my final 10 levels on the Mercenary, I'm going to take the critical chance and damage nodes as well, but I don't have them on the build currently as of making this video. Finally, I also dipped off to the left hand side as well, taking most of the armor and evasion nodes, and I also used these +8 attribute buffs to fill out my attribute requirements on some gear and skills. For the Ascendancy, I chose Witch Hunter to just stack on more AoE damage as well as getting a global culling strike effect, and the Decimating Strike, which can take off up to 30% of a boss's health bar on the first hit. I took the Zealous Inquisition first, which can make enemies explode on death and deal their full life total in damage to other enemies. Then for Ascension 2 and 3, I took Culling Strike and Decimating Strike, which are both quite useful for rare monsters and bosses. As of making this video, I have not achieved the 4th Ascendancy because I apparently suck at the Trials of Sekhmet. So that last point is still up for debate. That covers how I have my passive tree set up right now. Overall, I find my damage feels pretty good with this setup, but past level 85, I have felt like I want to be more tanky. The thing is that I can't really see any way to do that with the passive tree without giving up damage to respec and go all the way over to the monk tree for evasion and energy shield passives instead. So I'm still kind of cooking up what I want to do next for that one. With that out of the way, let's quickly talk about gear. Really, the two most important pieces are your crossbow and the key unique for this build, the Blueflame Bracers. The bracers are really cheap on the trading market, like 1 Exalted Orb, and I've been using them all the way up to level 90 for this build, even though they're only item level 45 or so. This does mean that you do need to get extra good rolls on your other armor to max out your resistances, but I still feel like it's been worth it so I can use explosive bolts and have it benefit from all of my focus on cold damage and freeze buildup. And as you can see here, I still have managed to cap all resistances with 70% armor and 50% evasion, which I think is okay for missing like one high level piece of armor on the build. For the crossbow, you want to roll as high as possible on increased physical damage and plus to either projectile skills or all attack skills. I used a perfect Essence of Battle, I believe, to roll +6 to all attack skills on my current crossbow, and it shot my damage up like crazy. After that, plus physical damage and plus cold damage are some of the better additions, with anything extra just kind of being a bonus. For the rest of the armor pieces, I just stacked the typical stuff, maxed out resistances, getting increased armor and evasion on everything, as much movement speed as possible on the boots, and more life wherever it can show up. If you get good rolls on resistances, I slapped in iron runes to pump up the armor and evasion as well. For rings, I basically just used mine to stack resistances, and I also tried to look out for percentage increases to cold damage because those seem to stack pretty well since all the damage on this entire build is cold. For the amulet, get whatever you need to round out your defenses or attribute requirements. And if you're lucky enough or rich enough to find an amulet with +3 to projectile skills, that would really juice up the damage on this build, but I haven't been lucky enough to snag one for myself yet, and I'm kind of running low on divine orbs. Finally, for charms, you definitely want a thawing charm to protect from being frozen, and then if you can find it or afford the divine orbs to buy one, I really recommend the Fall of the Axe silver charm. This thing makes you immune to being slowed and grants onslaught to actually increase your movement speed and attack speed if you would be slowed. I was lucky enough to get this very early in the game, but it's quite expensive on the trading website, so good luck with that one. And with that, I think I've covered basically everything on this build. I'm currently level 90 with it, and the final optimization I want to make is to increase my survivability, but I'm kind of stuck on where to start with that. To be honest, I also don't know enough about the Atlas skill tree to confidently recommend anything there. Currently, I'm just stacking pack size for XP gain and Asmeri spirit chance because I'm trying to farm the unique stuff that the spirits can drop, but that's about as far as I got. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching, and I sincerely hope you enjoy this build if you give it a try yourself. Like I said earlier, this is the first build I've ever solo crafted all the way from level 1 to level 90 without giving up and just looking for a meta build. I really am interested in feedback to improve this one, so if you have any suggestions, please leave them down below and I'll be sure to try it out. Thanks again for checking out the video. I have a link to my Twitch stream in the description if you want to come say hi, and until next time, stay safe out there, my friends.